In recent months, boycotts, protests, and marches around the nation have highlighted the unfair wages for those working in the fast food industry. New York is no stranger to that controversy. But what about those who make drinks, serve food, clean tables, and deliver takeout from local restaurants? New York sets different hourly minimums for various types of tipped workers, ranging from $4.90 an hour to $5.65. Well, even when combined with their tips, is that enough for waiters, busboys, and bartenders?
New York's minimum wage will increase to $8.75 an hour by year's end. Should the minimum wage for tipped workers go up too? Or should Albany do what some employers are doing, eliminating the tipping system entirely? Here to discuss this complicated set of questions are Louis Peckman, a prominent labor attorney and the founder of WaiterPay.com. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Along with two members of the New York City chapter of the State Restaurant Association, Andrew Moselle, its legislative consultant, and Farid Ali, who owns Bogota Latin Bistro in Park Slope and sits on the board of directors. Gentlemen, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And also joining us from El Diario newspaper is Ana Nieto, senior business correspondent, and welcome to BK Live.
Thank you.
Thanks all of you for being here. So why don't we start with something that I think that there's a lot of confusion about, which is the minimum wage versus the tip wages, right?
There's something which is called a tip credit in New York and in other states. There's a federal minimum wage under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is $2.13 an hour for tipped employees, but in New York, the tip minimum wage is $5 an hour. And the principle is if you're receiving tips, you could receive less than the current minimum wage of $8 an hour. So it's important to note that if you're working as a busboy, if you're working as a waiter, as long as you get notice that you're going to be paid a tip minimum wage, that tip minimum wage in New York is $5 an hour. Notably, though, and a lot of employers have to take note of this, for delivery persons, the tip minimum wage is $5.65 per hour.
$5.65.
And one of the common misconceptions about the tipped wage, it's not that the employee, let's say no one came into the restaurant that hour, only gets paid $5 an hour. It's actually the law that they have to get the minimum wage if they don't reach that with their tips. So if they don't get any tips that day, they still would get paid $8 or $8.75 later in the year.
A 4-hour, 5-hour
Correct,
shift,
yeah.
whatever that would be. But how is that even calculated? There's a lot going on in restaurants, and you know, just because you assume you have a table, you could have got 3 tables and nobody tipped you. How's that worked out?
Well, there are many different systems that restaurants use. One system, which is legal under the law, is that I get the tips from my tables that I get, and there's lots of both electronic and bookkeeping systems that keep track of that. Another is a pooled system where everyone who gets tips puts it all into one sort of pot, and then we split that up at the end of the night. Both systems have their own laws and regulations that are quite complicated, and that's one of the things we're trying to educate our members about and try to bring more knowledge in the industry is how to comply with those laws, because more and more we're seeing lawsuits that are becoming an incredible economic burden on restaurants.
Now, why are these lawsuits sort of so widespread? Is this something that, as a New York restaurant industry, has always sort of been the case, or as more cases come forward, more people realize that there are certain rights that they have not been taken advantage of, or?
Well, it's not just a New York phenomenon. We've had cases in other states. We've had cases upstate. We've had cases in Chicago, in Florida. But the issue in New York is you have so many restaurants and you have such an economy here which is dependent on restaurants, and you also have a high degree of undocumented workers. In my view, a lot of the cases that we have are undocumented workers who are being abused and who are being underpaid because an employer thinks that they could get away with that. There are a number of restaurants that have gotten wise to what the laws are, and the laws are very complicated, and there are special rules that apply to restaurants. But I think employees in general are becoming much more aware of their rights, and as word spreads, people are saying, well, I didn't know that an employer could take my tips. I didn't know X, Y, Z. I didn't know that I don't have to pay for customer walkouts. And as the news spreads amongst employees in the workforce, more and more lawsuits are being filed.
I see. Now, Farid, you actually pay what's considered a very good wage at your restaurant. Why did you choose to go that route?
I just think that it gave us the differential advantage over other restaurants in order to retain employees. Hire the best, pay them really good wages, and develop them so that I wouldn't lose them to the guy next door for an extra 25 cents.
Right, right. Now, the truth is, like, a lot of people have this misconception about restaurants, or this idea about restaurants, that people who work there are just being flat out exploited. Like, where did that come from then?
Well,
As the that was for you.
as someone who has about 60 lawsuits pending against restaurants right now, I think there's a wide variety of violations that employers commit. Some are very willful, some are intentional, some are outright cheating employees. Others are because some of the restaurants are misinformed. They don't know what spread of hours is, for example. They don't know about the tip credit. So it covers a very, very wide range. But what we're seeing is in the industry, for people who aren't represented by the association and people who don't have competent counsel like Farid has and who are making an effort to be above board and to comply with all the rules, there's a world of restaurants out there that totally ignore, either willfully or not willfully, but they're ignoring the law and the requirements. And the penalties under the law are very, very significant.
Okay.
I think that because of the media attention some of these issues have received, there is a conception this is what's going on as a matter of course in the restaurant industry. The fact is that while there are some bad apples out there, the vast majority of restaurateurs, especially in New York City, are actually paying their employees much more than the minimum wage. As a result of a study that our association has done, we saw that the actual median income is well over $10 statewide, and it's much more than that even in the city here. And places like Farid's are very common where to keep workers in the back of the house, they're paying $16, $17, even $18 an hour. So we think that that's more indicative, especially the economy here in New York City.
Okay.
Well, I mean, part of New York City economy, Brooklyn's economy, is such a touristy sort of place. We're a food kind of town. So, a large part of our population is totally dependent on tipping.
Right.
And we were talking a little earlier, we were saying that tipping is a cultural thing.
Right.
We assume as Americans that, people understand tipping culture. However, that's, so many times when you work in a restaurant,
Right.
that's sort of not the case. So what is it that people, when they come to America, sort of don't understand? What is it that we're not putting out the information that, hey, we just don't pay our workers this,
It is the only country I can think of where...
The only one?
I cannot think of any other, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we all tip everywhere else, yes, but we don't tip a percentage of what you're paying for your food. You tip a gratuity. A gratuity is something that comes from you because you like how you have been served, you like the treatment, you like the food, so you want to make a statement, yes, here it is. But when it is a percentage, it is not perceived as a gratuity.
Right.
It's part of your bill.
Right.
And this is something very, very difficult to explain to somebody who is coming here for 2-3 days, because this is not how these people are doing at home. Normally, in every other industry, is the employer who pays the full salary of the employee. That works also for the restaurants in every other place. Really, I've been traveling extensively, and I do not recall ever seeing anything like this. And in fact, I received a lot of people from every other countries, and you have to explain. It is very difficult for them to understand that they have to leave. It's good if you leave 16, 18, 20%.
Right.
And they look at you and say, really?
Yeah, which is a lot. I mean, even to a lot of people that live in New York, they feel like, I'll leave you something. It might not necessarily be that 18 or 20% unless they feel like they got very, very exceptional service. So why not just incorporate that into the cost of the food? Or is there another way to work around it so that awkwardness is kind of eliminated? And it also happens like when you're out to dinner with people, right? Where I might be like, because I have experience in that industry, like, no, I'm gonna leave something. They might have had, 3 bad tables. I don't wanna be that person. But why not just make it simpler and incorporate it into the cost of the food?
Well, that's what would happen. I mean, tipping is more than just a cultural phenomenon in our society. What it is essentially the way we've set up the business model of restaurants. If you either got rid of tipping completely or you changed the model of it, basically what you'd be doing is you'd be shifting the economic burden from the consumer to the restaurateur. And labor costs are what, Farid? I mean, they're like 60 or 70% of most restaurants' businesses. It's actually when you buy the food, you're not paying $20 for that steak for the steak. You're paying $20 for to rent the table, for the beautiful lighting, for the renovation, and for the waiter to serve you the food. So if we were to actually shift that burden, it would probably come back to consumers in one way or the other.
Right. I mean,
There's a lot of noise from consumers about wanting to increase the minimum wage for restaurant employees, but I also, at the same time, I don't know how willing people are and how far they're willing to go to pay the increased cost that will eventually be passed on to the consumer. I have a Latin restaurant.
Right.
And,
It's a very good Latin restaurant, by the way.
the model behind my Latin restaurant, I always said, why is it that when people want just a basic good plate of rice, beans, and maduros, they got to crawl into some,
Right.
dirty hole somewhere,
Right.
rather than a place that has elevated the service, the ambiance. And I get people questioning, why am I paying X number of dollars for rice and beans when I can get it at some Cucci Frito
Right.
for $5? I'm charged, granted it's more than rice and beans,
Right.
but one, the people don't get that they're paying for everything that's involved.
Sure, sure.
And I don't know how willing they'd be I raise the minimum wage, but then there's the issue, your prices are too expensive.
I mean, how difficult must it be to change an entire industry? Where do we sort of begin? I mean, it begins with the legislation, it begins with the restaurant boards, it begins with the people. But I mean, New York City, as a New York City waiter for a number of years, it was all just always interesting to me that how different people tipped. And then when I would tell people, and it's a good thing when people actually inquire. It means they're asking, hey, this was great. How much should I leave you?
Right.
And then you sort of explain New York system to them, and they would just be flabbergasted and sometimes offended. They're like,
exactly.
what do you mean? You live in America and
Right,
we only
right.
pay you, sort of this amount. And so, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is unique to the United States. It's kind of difficult when you say it out loud to even people who are not familiar with the restaurant business. But it is what it is, and I think just changing the mindset of the way that we dine out is going to be a little time-consuming, a little complicated, but then let me flip it again. Now, there is a restaurant that I will not say the name of here in Brooklyn that just calculates the tip in no matter, it's not an option, or you don't decide the kind of gratuity that you leave. And I also noticed that those people were just kind of didn't come back and check on you and didn't, take very good care of you or give you very good service. So then there's that other side of it, that it's an incentive to servers to give exceptional service. So what do you guys think about that?
Well, there is a point of view that it's an incentive with respect to tips. There's a policy issue in a lot of restaurants. Do you have individual checks from waiters, or do you have a pooled house or shared tips between employees? But I think in terms of where it all ends up, it's really a function of management. If you have a good manager, if you have a restaurant like Farid's, I think regardless of whether it's a pooled house, whether it's a shared tip, whether it's a mandatory tip,
Right.
If people are going to be working at Farid's restaurant, they're going to be doing what they need to be doing. So I don't think that's as much of an issue. I think one of the issues in terms of when you're talking about culture and mandatory or not mandatory, it's, people I think are generally a little bit offended that you get the tip and that's what you have to pay. And then I think on the other hand, a lot of consumers, they want to leave a tip. So if you did have a mandatory charge, or if it was already built in, they'd feel uncomfortable about not leaving a tip because that's so ingrained. And it's even ingrained with respect to, now you go into a coffee shop or you go get your coffee in the morning and there's a tip jar. Well, somebody's pouring me coffee, giving me the coffee. Do I leave a tip? Do I not leave a tip? So it's really...
It creates a complication.
It's really
Tip
going all
everybody at
over.
this point.
Yeah.
I just tip everybody. So
Part
as
of
a
a big
reporter, how do you
budget.
sort of see this? How do you sort of see this issue played out?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, as a reporter, as somebody who's reported on this issue and the economic costs for a while, how do you sort of see it playing out over the next few years?
Well, I think that from my point of view, it's going to be very, very difficult to eradicate tipping. I mean, people are now used to that, and there is a whole setting of laws that it's governing this. So it's going to be very, very difficult. I guess that it will be a more of an individual decision of restaurants looking forward if they want to. Some people are very happy with their tips. They work in high-end restaurants and they get a lot of money.
Right.
And some others that don't, that they work in neighborhood restaurants, they don't get as much. We've seen how this winter has impacted
Absolutely.
a lot of people because the restaurants had a very tough time just putting several tables every night. And,
Right.
and I think this is something that maybe it's a lesson to be learned by everybody, but I don't think it's going to be changing anytime soon. It's so ingrained, as we
Right.
said, it's so ingrained. It doesn't change overnight.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
So let's get into the top violations and some of the, and we talked about the service charge off camera a bit.
Right.
What's the difference between gratuity added into a check and the service charge?
Well, a service charge is mandatory, and there's a special law in New York that if you have a service charge, which is on a check, and this could be at a banquet, at a bar mitzvah, at a wedding, if someone's charging you 20% as a service charge, the law treats that now as a gratuity. That money should be distributed to the employees, whereas it used to be the law that if it was a service charge, well, that's really house money. But the other violations that we see are management dipping into tips. Tips is very protective with respect to employees. It's the employees' money. You can't have a manager taking tips. You have some employers, they charge for different things, for example, customer walkouts, things like that. So there's very good protective labor legislation in New York for employees, and employers in the restaurant industry, they face a lot of challenges with respect to complying with what they need to be doing. There is a special law in New York, for example, about spread of hours. If you're in a restaurant and if you work more than 10 hours or a spread of hours of more than 10 hours, then you're entitled to an extra hour at minimum wage of $8 regardless of how much you get paid. So if you're in the back of the house, front of the house, you have to get paid that extra hour. So there's a bunch of ways that employers are violating or can violate the law if they're not informed.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. So.
Yeah, last 30, 45 seconds over to this side. What are you guys doing to combat these kind of things that take place in some restaurants, dipping into tips and so on?
Well, education is the best thing we can do. I mean, our association, we hold regular seminars on wage and hour laws, on, it's only going to get more complicated because at some point people are going to have to comply with Obamacare. In New York City, we've recently just passed a paid sick leave law, which actually has some very stringent reporting requirements, so you can keep track of how many hours and how many paid sick leaves people have. So it's becoming more and more difficult for especially small businesses to be able to comply with this wealth of laws that are well intended, but at some point there's going to be a tipping point in New York City where people are just going to say, it's too difficult to do business here. I might go open my business in Florida where the rules aren't so strict.
Okay.
And as for myself, I'm just positioning myself as a leader in this area to model for other restaurant owners what can be done, what is possible. Speaking to what Andrew just said, I think education is really, really crucial here. I think the big challenge here is that how many thousands of restaurants are there in New York, all kinds of different restaurants, how many laws are out there that people are completely unaware of, and then you've got restaurant owners that come from completely different backgrounds, cultural, societal, education. It's very hard to disseminate and receive all the information that's out there that's required in order to be successful in this industry. It's very challenging.
By the way, when I said tipping point, there was no pun intended.
Well, we want to thank you all for joining us today. The debate will continue, and we hope you all join us again soon.
Yes,
Thanks.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all being here.